In this video, we're going to explore the science of information and water. This really goes into sort of the theoretical background of what we do here at Nest Health. And I think will just help you to understand that there's a lot of really fascinating modern science that supports what we do. It also just calls into question kind of everything we think about reality. There's just a lot of neat stuff going on, and this really should just serve as an introduction, because if you find this fascinating, you should just start looking online. Pay attention to the new science articles coming out on quantum physics, on information, on water. There's so much fascinating stuff. So we're really just going to kind of explore that here for a little while in this video and give you a sense of our background and maybe make you feel a little bit more comfortable as you're working with clients and maybe they have some questions. This is the type of thing that you can start feeling you can use to explain some concepts to them. Maybe not in this depth, they're not going to be interested to this degree, but I hope that you will be. So we're going to start out with this concept of standing waves. Now, a standing wave, they actually have these pools built, and we're going to look at this video in just a second about this, but basically they have a pool, is a long rectangle, and they will use something to start pushing out waves. But as it starts, of course, these waves are just ripples, okay? They're going to go back and they're going to hit the other end. And when they hit the other end, they're, of course, going to return. And what happens is, if you remember studying waves back in science when you were in school or something like that, you find out that if they are at a certain interval, then if the peak of one wave hits the trough of another, they're actually going to cancel out, and you'll actually just get flat water, even though you have it going both directions, right? And if you have the peak of one wave hitting the peak of another, they'll actually double. They'll add on to each other. And so what you have is, with a standing wave, you actually have these waves going out and coming back at just the right interval that the troughs and peaks meet, and they just flow up and down like that. They look like they're standing as opposed to moving. And so we're going to take a quick look at that in this video. So with that concept in mind of this standing wave, there are theories out there that effectively all the particles, the energy particles of the world, like the electron, are actually just standing waves. They are information being sent out and information received from the rest of the field of the electrons in the case of the electron. So you can take a look at this picture of the electron as an example of that. You can see that they're showing it as this series of waves going out and coming in. You can't see that necessarily in a still photo, but you get the concept from that wave pool that we were talking about. Okay, so taking this idea that everything is about waves, I want to point out this quote that comes from a book that I'll tell you more about later, but this is a great quote, and it goes with things that Einstein said and other physicists have said along the way. And this quote is, "The wave aspect of the particle is the fundamental aspect." That is the wave, okay? It says the particle phase is not the real phase. So when we think of energy, yes, we tend to think of these little bits, right? These little bits that we can think of as existing. But in fact, it's really this wave that we would think of like a wave in an ocean, but think of it as a wave in space that you can't see. You can only conceptualize as a wave in an ocean. This is the fundamental reality. And when you get to these little bits that we call particles, that's actually not the fundamental. That's the result of pressure building up within these waves. And that's where you really have the center point of an electron, which we would call this bit of energy, right, is really just where these standing waves meet and coalesce. So taking this idea of waves as reality, we also know that there is this particle aspect of it, and so physicists have studied something called the double slit experiment to explore this concept of, is something a wave, is it a particle? And so this famous double slit experiment involves them shooting like lots of electrons or photons, some energy particles. They would shoot towards these two slits. And they would try to find out by measuring where they landed on a wall behind those slits. They would try to find out, is this acting as a wave or is this acting as a particle? So if it were acting as particles, these particles would go through the two slits and they would create two lines on the measuring device behind that wall. If instead it were acting as waves, what would happen is these waves would go through those slits and they would continue to spread the way waves do, and they would interact. And by interacting, you would have several points at which on that wall they would show up, they would be captured along that wall. And so there's an image we have here that shows what that would look like. Okay, so this is actually an image of what they would capture on that wall. So that's what happens when they sort of flooded electrons or photons towards these dual slits. But then they decided to try something a little bit different, and they started sending out just one particle at a time. And particle, again, we're wondering, is it a particle? Is it a wave? But they would send out one electron at a time, one photon at a time. And they would find out what would happen. Now, you would think if they're just sending out one particle at a time, there would be none of this wave interference, right? And so you wouldn't have these multiple lines along that back wall. You would only have one depending on which slit it went through. But what they found out was sending out one at a time still created an interference pattern. And so you can see in this other image we have here that at first there was just one dot at a time, one dot at a time, but over time you could start to see it building up these multiple lines once again. And it's really fascinating because what this means is that a single electron was interfering with itself. What it tells us is that as it was sent out from this little gun that was shooting these things out towards the slits, it was going out actually as a wave, and therefore was going through both slits at the same time and interfering with itself. Therefore, at the point of measurement against that back wall, it was indeed a particle. That's where it was measured. But until that point, it was behaving as a wave. So then it's really interesting when we go to the next stage of this double slit experiment. So they tried a few different things to see whether these electrons would act as particles or waves still further. So the first thing they did was they put in some measuring devices along these two slits. Okay, so at the point that the electron was passing through the one slit or the other, they would measure because they wanted to find out which slit it was actually going through. Well, when they did this, instead of those interference patterns happening after the two slits, there was no longer an interference pattern. Basically, the act of measuring as it passed through this slit collapsed the wave function, and now that electron acted as a particle. And so you ended up getting just those two lines where the slits were along the back wall where they were doing the measurements. They got just two lines. It was now acting as a particle. Well, that's pretty fascinating. What that tells us is that that measurement is collapsing a wave function. But now they said, well, we're going to try something different. And they actually, there's a very roundabout way they had to figure out how to do this, but they figured out a way to measure which slit it went through after it went through there, thinking, okay, that won't interfere with it. It can still create an interference pattern with itself, but we're going to know which slit it went through. When they did this, they measured which slit it went through after it had already gone through. Unfortunately, that measurement still collapsed the wave function, and now that electron still acted as a particle, and you still got the two lines of measurement against the back wall. So here's where it gets even more interesting. Not even sure I can explain this, but this, if none of this has blown your mind so far, this should blow your mind, because this is where you start saying reality isn't exactly what we think it is. It's really kind of complex. Because what they did next is they took those same measuring devices, but they didn't turn them on. They had the intention of a measurement there because the devices were there, but they didn't turn them on and they didn't take a measurement. And strangely enough, the electrons still acted as particles as if they had been measured. So it's really, really fascinating when you start exploring this stuff. Well, what does this actually tell us? What does this mean? First of all, as we talked about, these waves are universally present. Okay, so we talked about these standing waves, these electrons, and all electrons communicating through this electron field, and all particles communicating through their fields. Okay, and so these waves are universally present. What happens is the particles are only present when they are measured in some way. Whatever that means, we're going to talk about that in just a second, but they have to be measured in some way, like those measuring instruments we talked about on those slits. It has to be measured before that wave actually, it's what they call a wave function, collapses and a single particle appears, okay? So what this means to me is we know that a scientific measurement will do it, but we also know that human consciousness will do this. There's all sorts of problems that science has down at the quantum level when they're trying to do studies because their expectations actually influence the results. However, we have to say, well, if it's only human consciousness or scientific measurements, well then how did anything become a particle before humans existed? And so, by definition, there is some sort of measurement taking place that allows these wave functions to collapse long before humans, long before scientific instruments exist. So whether that's a universal consciousness or whatever you want to call that, there is something collapsing wave functions. And this is bigger than we are as individuals. This is a universal something that created the known universe that we understand, that we can easily measure and see, right? So something is collapsing all of this. That means that when we are collapsing our things within our own experience, whether it's our own body field or the world around us, we are having an influence through our consciousness, okay, on what's happening to us in our bodies and around us. And certainly this influence takes place between humans and throughout the whole human race, I'm sure. It's going to be taking place to some degree with all forms of consciousness. Whether that's animals, whether the earth has a consciousness, whether energy has a consciousness, wherever we actually have consciousness, this is all interacting. So we are not the sole contributors to what's going on, but we play a role. And of course, our most intimate role is in our own body field and how we're collapsing that reality and affecting our own health and well-being. Now, I want to bring this to the point of the bioenergetic wellness system, the Nest Health system, right? And how these assessments work. Because basically what you have is you have this field with infinite possibilities in any given moment. And at the moment we measure with our device, we are collapsing the wave function into a particular reading. And therefore you have a very specific reading in that moment as to what the body field is looking at like and how we can support it. Now we'll go more into those details and repeatability and things like that in other videos, but right now just think of this as this concept of the assessment is taking a look at a field with all this potential. And remember, those lines appeared in many different places. Those dots got read in all these different places in this dual slit experiment, right? And so in the same situation, or in a similar way, you could have all these different possibilities becoming one dot, one dot, one dot in that experiment each time they shot one electron. So when you're doing a reading, one of the many possibilities is what actually shows up. Now, one of the interesting things that we're finding is that science is wrestling with this. I found this great article recently titled, Is Matter Conscious? Is matter conscious? Okay? Well, matter is the actual particles. And I don't believe that's where the consciousness actually resides. I believe it is the wave function, all possibility that is collapsed or perceived by consciousness in some form. And therefore, we have these questions. Is matter conscious? I don't think matter is conscious. I do believe it's the result of consciousness. And therefore, consciousness plays a really big role for us as practitioners and for our clients. So as they come to see us and work with us, our conscious experience with them, our intention, all of these things actually really, really matter. And one of the things that we really like to focus on is the fact that the heart is the center of the body field. It actually it actually joins several different aspects of the body field, and it connects us most directly with the big earth fields, right? And the more we can develop this and basically have a conscious interaction from here, as opposed to just up here with our clients, the more we can really impact them and their journey. And that doesn't just mean the moment they're sitting in with you. We may have a stronger relationship with them in the moment that they are right there in our field, but we have this, these universal waves and this connection to everything at all distances. So we're always having an impact. So in my mind, literally, the higher we can raise our consciousness and the higher we can raise our intentions for the people we work with and just who we are as individuals, that's going to have a greater impact on the people we work with. So there's always, as wellness practitioners, it's always in our best interest, in our clients' best interest, for us to be evolving and developing ourselves from the inside out. Now the next thing we're going to take a look at is this nifty little video on pendulums. Now I love this video because, well, partly because it's just beautiful. It's a little humor at the beginning, and then it's just this beautiful dance of these pendulums. And I want to explain this to you before you actually watch the videos. So each pendulum in this is just, the only difference between them is they're on different lengths of strings, and so their frequency is a little bit different. The time it takes to go back and forth, right, is a little bit different. And so the next one's a little bit longer, and it's going to take a little bit longer time to swing back and forth. And so they have all these different lengths, and as they are all released together, they create these amazing patterns, and not just one pattern. They go through many different patterns together as a group. And I want you to think about the fact that if you brought together different things of different frequencies, how they would create together a pattern. And that pattern is something that nature can follow. Their energy would build around those information waves, right? So those waves are basically carrying information. We'll talk about that later as well. But the waves are carrying information. And so each one, as you combine them together, they create a unique pattern. And that's where you would get unique molecules, unique cells. As things build up in more complex and complex wave patterns, you move up from atoms to molecules to cells and tissues and so forth onto everything we know. Okay, so I want you to watch this and see how simply just combining different frequencies creates a series of patterns that combined would give nature a pattern to follow. And I want you to notice at the very end of the video that it has come back to the original pattern. And if those pendulums continue to be powered, and we'll talk about how we are continually powered and therefore patterns could continue, if these pendulums were powered and kept doing their rate of oscillation, the complex pattern that they form, it's not a single pattern, it goes back and forth, back and forth, and back and forth, but eventually comes back around to the same thing. So it's like it had this conversation, and then it would have that same conversation over and over and over again. And as we talk about the big body field later, we will see how we talk about it repeats itself over and over and over, remaking ourselves all the time, probably billions of times per second. It's so fast we don't know it, but we're constantly recreating ourselves. And that, I think, is what's sort of visualized in this video with pendulums.
Hello? Are you ready? Yes. Then we'll begin.
So it's a pretty incredible sort of visualization of what frequencies, when combined, can do, isn't it? And so now let's take a quick look at sort of a summary of what we've gone through so far. So we have standing waves representing all potentials for a particle to exist in, right? And it is with the consciousness or measurement of some sort that collapses that into a reality. Now, when you have multiple standing waves, you create patterns like we just sort of saw in that video. And so what you have is when we're talking about simply waves in space, right? You're now creating what you could call patterns of waves or patterns of information in space prior to the collapse of something into an energetic and eventually chemical reality, right? And so we're talking about wave patterns in space, and this is what Peter Fraser referred to as structures in space. So if you're ever reading something that Peter had written on this concept and how he did his matching, we'll talk a little bit about that later. This is what he's talking about, these structures in space that when you have similarities of structures in space, they can actually communicate with each other more easily than things that don't have such similarities. Okay, so again, the consciousness then chooses and collapses that down to an actual reality, what we would call reality, which is when we get to the point of energy, which is more easily measured than something like information. And then, of course, as I said, that builds up into actual atoms and molecules, cells, tissues, and so forth, and builds the world that we are most familiar with on a day-to-day basis. Now, an important point about all of this is that it's the precision of those patterns that determines coherence within a system. What do I mean by that? So we go back to that pendulum. If you had thrown off just one of those pendulums from the pattern, all of a sudden a whole new conversation is had, isn't it? There's something different about that conversation, and as a result, it cannot, if let's say one liver cell has a certain pattern to it and another liver cell has a certain pattern to it, they can communicate very easily when they're both doing what they're supposed to. But if the pattern of information in one of those is thrown off, they can no longer communicate as well as they could before. There's not a resonance between them, and so the coherence of the system as a whole is starting to break down. And the more you have this situation where some of those cells are losing the accuracy of information in them, the more you have a breakdown of coherence in the liver as a whole. And that's when you can start to have communication problems along the integrators, or you can have energy problems within the drivers, that type of thing. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about structures in space. It's basically information patterns and whether they can communicate with each other. This is really, really important. Now I've got another video for you. And when you take a look at this one, I want you to again see, first of all, the power of standing waves. This will be an actual visualization of standing waves and their power to actually levitate something. I also want you to pay attention when he talks about this, this reflector plate that the standing waves are bouncing against. Pay attention to what happens when he moves it just a little bit, okay? Because precision is what allows these standing waves to exist. And when you move that plate out just a little bit, the standing wave starts to break down and no longer does the physical function, like in this case, levitation, that it is meant to do. So you're going to see the power of standing waves and the power of precision in terms of alignment of things in this video. And also take note of the power of sound. And the reason I want you to take note of that is because for us, sound plays a really important role in the powering of the overall body field. So the drivers, one of the things that helps to power them is the sounds that are occurring in the body and the amplification of those sounds from all of the many cavities within the body, from the very big ones to the very small. We'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. So take a look at this video on levitation with sound waves.
I'd like to show you an example of levitating small objects with sound waves. Let me just remind you how a loudspeaker works. It's just a diaphragm that repeatedly pushes on the air, producing high pressure waves that move away. And that's what we have here with this little gizmo. It does the same thing, except it's at a very high frequency, 28,000 hertz, which is way above our human hearing range. So these sound waves move upward, And up above, I have a glass plate, which is going to reflect the sound back down again. And when the distance between the glass plate and the loudspeaker is just right, then those sound waves that are moving down will interfere constructively with the sound waves coming up and give us regions of high pressure and low pressure, which don't move around. They stay in one spot. And it's in those high pressure zones that I'm going to try to levitate a small ball. So let me turn on the power, and even though I can't hear it, I'm still going to use ear protection. As I said before, the distance between the reflector and the loudspeaker is just right. If I change it, and which I'm going to do, you'll see that this standing wave disappears and the balls are no longer suspended there. We've now set up the little loudspeaker and the reflector in front of this mirror, which is part of our Schlieren optic setup. And the purpose of that is to be able to actually see where there are regions of high pressure and low pressure in the air, especially the air between the reflector and the loudspeaker. So let me turn up the volume, and before I do that, I will put on my protective hearing. And if I adjust the height of the reflector, there's a point at which you see bands of white, light, and dark. This is the standing wave, and it only happens when the distance between the reflector and the speaker is some multiple of a half a wavelength. So every single one of those bands is a half a wavelength. If I go up a little higher, then it disappears again, but if I continue to go higher, then it will come back when I'm at another half a wavelength, a multiple of a half a wavelength away. Now, it's in these bands that I'm going to place the little balls. And you can see the little ball settles down where there's a bright band, and that is the high pressure area. And I know it's a high pressure because you see there's a white band right next to the reflector, which is where the highest pressure will be. If I, again, change the height, the standing wave goes away, and the little balls will fall down.
So we're going to do another video now, but it's going to sort of carry that idea forward, because what we're going to do now is we're going to look at, again, the power of sound in terms of creating actual waves in water. This is what's called a cymoscope. You're going to see a little bit about how the cymoscope works, and you're going to see what happens when sound creates different vibrations in water, and how as you adjust that sound, it creates different vibrations, and you're going to see, once again, patterns develop that nature would follow. You're literally going to see patterns that nature does follow, because you're going to see these crystalline structures that look identical to snowflakes. And as you break it down, as they show you individual snapshots of this process, you're going to see how that one sound in water is creating lots of different snowflake shapes, because every instant it's varying just a little bit. And they say there's no two snowflakes alike. Whether that's true or not, there's tremendous variety, and this can help to explain that. I want you to think about a snowy day. If you have ever seen snow, and if you're living in warmer climates, you can imagine, or if you've seen it in the movies, right? You've got the snow falling down, but what happened for that snow to fall down? It was water at one point. It had to become crystallized. And when you see these many different snapshots, the individual pictures of what's happening as it's moving through this process, you can imagine that each instant of time where a piece of water, right, a droplet of water, became a snowflake, why every one of them could be looking different, because it's the exact instant when that particular droplet turned into a snowflake based on the frequency inputs that were basically surrounding that crystal structure, that snowflake is actually capturing information of the frequencies that were interacting with it at that time. So this is really neat. I also want you to take a notice as you're going through this video, this point that, first of all, remember the standing wave pool. It started out without standing waves, right? There was just this little thing. So you're going to see as the frequencies begin, there's no pattern right away. It has to build up until there's enough interaction in the water that all of a sudden these shapes appear. I will also notice as you move between different frequencies that you're going to have this shape that collapses into chaos and then needs to reach another frequency level before it returns and into a different shape. And this is really important if you think about, if you know anything about quantum leaps at the atomic level, where you have electrons that move from one cloud level around a nucleus and they leap to the next cloud level. It does not move. The electron does not move between these cloud levels. It has simply gone from here and now it's here. And it's because there is no coherence between those cloud levels. At the point of the one cloud level, you have coherence, and at the next, you have coherence. And in the same way, you're going to see that here, where there's a lack of coherence as the frequency moves up and it reaches that next level of coherence, and boom, there's a new pattern that appears. And we'll see a little bit about that later when we talk about water scientists and what they're finding with, for example, homeopathic remedies, and why certain frequencies seem to work, certain frequencies don't seem to work. We'll talk more about that. Gather the concept from this video here, and then we'll continue forward.
What we're seeing here is a small sample of water being vibrated by sound. The first view is the container or ring holding the water from spilling off of the face of the lens. Light shines up from the bottom, through the lens, and passes through the vibrating water. Here we have a side view. The light travels up through another set of lenses and is reflected off of a mirror onto a flat surface where we can view the magnified image of the standing waves, which are created within the water sample by the sound that we hear in the background. This beautiful harmonic pattern portrays a radially symmetrical form frequently seen in nature, as in flowers and small sea creatures. As we change the frequency, the pattern immediately changes in response to the animating tone. If we view this phenomena in slow motion from above, we can see a much clearer view of the movement within the water sample itself. You can see it moving within itself, undulating, almost like the motion of a jellyfish, moving into the center and back out again, all the while maintaining a very regular and coherent pentagonal shape. This same phenomenon, when viewed as before, reveals this 10-faceted jewel, an almost perfect crystalline structure. Yet this is a dynamic structure, portraying the standing waves created by the two phases of the pentagonal shape we saw undulating so clearly from above. If we slow down this phenomenon even further, viewing it at 1 frame per second, while focusing the camera lens on a focal plane within the water sample, we can observe this remarkable sequence of harmonic patterns as a series of static, crystal-like lattices. The similarity of these forms to ice crystals is undeniable. While this unique perspective accentuates the structural elements, there is another process at play here which is equally astounding. As mentioned earlier, the liquid moves through regular phases, undulating through itself in response to the frequency of the vibration. As long as the frequency and the amplitude remain the same, the resulting pattern will be maintained, in this case, as a 6-sided hexagonal figure. Here again we see a rhythmic succession of phases, pulsating in total adherence to the animating tone. But if we change this tone, another phenomenon becomes immediately apparent. We start without any vibration and slowly increase the amplitude. Concentric waves appear, much like you'd see if you dropped a pebble in water. As we increase the amplitude ever so slightly, a dramatic effect ensues. Here, viewed in slow motion, we can begin to see this stable structure dissolving into chaos. The patterns created in these experiments are determined by the quality of the substance. In this case, the very structure of the water itself determines the way it will respond when subjected to vibration. Different substances respond differently, depending on their viscosity or how fluid they are. In this instance, a four-figured quadrate pattern is formed in response to the tone that we hear in the background. If we vary the frequency of the tone, changing the pitch in other words, the pattern will change in accordance with the new pitch or frequency. If we vary the amplitude or the loudness, an entirely different series of patterns will emerge. In this case, the patterns repeat a hexagonal motif. If we look carefully, we can see that these hexagonal figures are actually the result of a trigonal or three-sided pattern moving in and out through itself in two phases, as we saw with the five-sided figure. As fascinating as these patterns may be, what is most interesting is watching their dynamics, the way they emerge from a state of turbulence. In fact, if you watch closely, you may observe that between every new form, there is a period of disintegration or chaos.
Now, just for fun, we're going to take a look at a study that was done at the Aerospace Institute of Stuttgart. So this picture will show you a lot in terms of the concept. Basically, it's suggesting that water is actually carrying information, and it's really fascinating what they found is they took one source of water and they had multiple students who then took drops of that water and dropped it onto a plate that they could then capture an image of. And when they did this, they found that each student's drop of water looked different. Well, that's not so surprising. For whatever reason, water would look different as different drops come down. But then, as they repeated it, they found that each student's drops seemed to have a pretty consistent look to them. And they did this in the picture that you're looking at. They did this 4 times. Each student's drops look very similar to each other, and they look very different from the drops provided by the other students. So this is a pretty fascinating concept of the idea that water can actually carry information. So when you talk about those frequencies that were injected into the water in the CymaScope video and creating patterns, here we have this idea, this possibility that individuals are releasing their own frequencies and actually impacting water in some type of way like that. And so if you've looked into the research of Dr. Masaru Emoto in the past, he has books on this concept where our thoughts, our intentions, music, different types of vibrations can all impact water. And what he would do is he would capture those in a frozen moment of time. He would crystallize them and take pictures of the crystals. And when you had water that was just out of the tap, you had some not very beautiful images showing up. And when you had them exposed to negative intentions, negative concepts, the water actually took on ugly shapes. And when it was exposed to positive information, it would take on these beautiful crystal shapes. And so we actually have an image of that, of 2 of our infoceuticals, as you can see here, and how they were shaped by the imprinting process versus just the standard tap water that would not have been imprinted like that. That really sort of brings us to the topic of water memory and remedies in general. Now, water memory is one of these topics where if a scientist dares to mention that term, he's just going to kind of get thrown out. He or she is just going to get thrown out of the industry because there's a lot of issues around it. For one thing, it changes everything. As soon as water carries information, it changes everything. And so a lot of science has really resisted this idea. Unfortunately for those scientists, other scientists who have been researching water have been finding evidence of water carrying memory for over 100 years, or around 100 years at this point. It just keeps coming back up. And they have tried to debunk it, but right now we have more and more scientists who are studying this and more papers and books being published on this concept. So it's really fascinating. Well, there's reasons why some of these things might be debunked, because we're finding there are times when it works, times when it doesn't work. Let's explore some of that. So we know that the history of water memory dates in some ways all the way back to at least the founding of homeopathy. Because in homeopathy you have these, essentially these dilutions with this process where you have a biologically active substance and it gets suffused or diluted to the point where that substance is no longer physically in the remedy. And yet that remedy seems to still have biological effect. And so this is the basis of homeopathy. Now, recent research shows that this can be done with some but not all substances. And this is why there may be some research showing that it doesn't in fact work. It's because it doesn't work with all substances, but it does seem to clearly work with many, and that's why you have millions of people using homeopathy worldwide, in spite of the fact that it is by the mainstream just sort of attacked and made to look like it doesn't work. But millions of people use it and swear by the results. It goes to tell you something, right? And I know if you go out and research, you're going to find a lot of details on how homeopathy has been able to work for people and research into results on that. Another thing that they've looked into is, well, is it just the suffussion process? Are you energizing the water itself to the point of it having an impact on the body? So they have attempted to do this without any original biologically active substance in the water. It's just water. They try shaking it to certain dilutions or what would be used to create a dilution, and there's no effect on the body. So if it didn't start out with a biologically active substance and they suffuse, they are going to end up with something that still doesn't have a biological activity in the body. So that's an important point. Another important point is they found that it needs to be exposed to an electromagnetic field in order to imprint the information into the water. So as this substance is being diluted out of the water, if this is done inside a Faraday cage where there is no exposure to electromagnetic fields, there's no imprint. It needs this power of this field to actually imprint the information of the original substance into the water. Now, taking us back to homeopathy, there was no way to produce an electric field back in the 1700s when this was being developed. So how was homeopathy actually getting imprinted? Well, it's because the earth itself is generating electromagnetic fields. And so within that field, you are able to produce these as long as you're not doing so inside a Faraday cage, which would prevent the Earth's fields from interacting. Now, one of the challenges that could possibly be bringing up for homeopathy today and could be altering its effectiveness versus when it was first developed is the fact that unlike back in the 1700s or the 1800s, apologies, it may be 1800s when Hahnemann was developing these, but back at that time you did not have the extent of electromagnetic fields from all the man-made devices that we have today. Today, homeopathy is shipped through X-rays and things like that, exposed constantly to just microwaves or to our phones or to the cell phone frequencies that are out there. Everything is just pummeling these with much stronger fields probably than the Earth's fields themselves, and maybe compromising that activity. I'm not saying that that's the case for sure, but I can say it's why we have found the infoceuticals to be extremely stable, because they're actually produced not with the help of the Earth's electromagnetic fields. They're actually produced under a 10,000 volt electric charge, and so they end up being very stable. We have tested them years after production and found them to be as powerful through our testing as they were when they were originally created. So just keep in mind that that's one benefit of using infoceuticals, is they are very, very stable, and they can be shipped and go through X-rays and things like that without losing the information that they have in them. So think about what that means for nature itself. Nature's got this built-in field that allows information everywhere, information from all the processes going on Earth, to imprint that information into water, which we know as the basis of life as we know it, right? And so water is this, it's like this carrying, it has this ability to carry the information from nature itself in order to build into these patterns that we've seen from sound and from these different frequencies. It's like water is this basis around which nature can build itself. And we'll see in a little bit that that DNA, for example, structures itself around water. And so the information that water is holding is really critical. And if you think about if water then is structured around something that is damaged, then that water will carry the information of that damaged biologically active substance, for instance. And think about all the things that we consume today and all of the genetically modified or the pesticides that are on the food, all those different things that are altering the information of the water and the information that we are receiving, and it's literally instructing the body. And you can see why we need to have correct information brought back into the body to try to restore the body field to the way it's meant to be. So water is this tremendous carrier of the information that is in space around us, okay? Now, we're going to take a look at a couple of water scientists. And the first is Jacques Benveniste. All right, he was this French scientist and renowned immunologist. He actually discovered platelet activating factor and was renowned in France, highly regarded, and unfortunately for him, got caught up in this exact area of science, which is he had somebody in his lab come to him and say basically they wanted to test dilutions and see if something that had been diluted could still have a biological effect. And Jacques says in a video that he actually had doubts that that would work. He was a skeptic when this began. But he started getting results in the lab. They started getting results that were showing they could dilute something, have none of the original substance left, and still get the biological effect that they were looking for. So he was astonished, and they spent several years continuing to do this research. And eventually they reached this point where they said, look, the world has got to know about this. Water can carry information and actually impact the body. It's incredible. So they reached out to Nature magazine, like the magazine for scientists to be published in. And they explained what was going on, and Nature reached out back to them and said, that sounds highly doubtful. We're going to have you do a couple of more years of research, and this is what we want you to explore. So apparently they went back for a couple of years, did more research, and came back to Nature again and said, listen, this is what we're getting. Nature effectively said, we're not going to publish it. Benveniste got very angry with them, said, you must publish this. We've gone through all this years. The world needs to know. And Nature agreed with them in the end. They said, okay, we will publish it under one condition. We are going to come over and test. We're going to publish, but then we're going to come over and test and verify what you have found. Benveniste thought he had nothing to hide. Let them come over and explore it for themselves, right? So it ended up getting published in Nature magazine, but with this caveat at the beginning of the article saying, just so you know, we don't think this is real. We think this is baloney, and we're going to go over and test this guy in his lab. We're going to just recreate this, and we're going to see if we can reproduce it. So what Benveniste found when they came over to test is that it was the editor of the magazine and two fraudbusters who came to basically debunk them. The goal was not to reproduce, it was to debunk. And unfortunately, what it sounds like is that they altered the actual test, and as a result, didn't get the same results. They used something that was less sensitive to the biological effects, and therefore did not see the effects. And they went back to Nature magazine and published that it was all a fraud, that it never really happened, and therefore you can forget about water memory. And so, of course, Benveniste just, his career got destroyed, and he continued to research into this over time, but no longer had this big lab that he had previously. Meanwhile, unfortunately, other labs were able to reproduce what he had originally done. So there's, it's just a fascinating thing, and I'm sure that both sides have information about it, but what's most interesting to me is that other labs seem to be able to reproduce his results, and it tells me that there's something here pretty much that's being buried, because we know it has this huge impact on the way the world works, on everything scientists think they know. Well, we're going to continue looking at water science here, and you're going to see that there's a lot of reason they should be relooking at water. So meanwhile, there was another French scientist who named Montagnier, Luc Montagnier, who basically took that same information that Benveniste had provided, and he pursued it even further. And he was able to build on this idea, and we find that water nanostructures and their electromagnetic resonance could faithfully perpetuate DNA information. In other words, he was basically able to take information from one piece of water, put it into another, and reproduce the information of the DNA within that. So again, this is just really brief. There are whole books. I'm going to refer you to a couple of books at the end of this where you can learn more. But this is another man, Montagnier, by the way, Nobel laureate, the man who discovered the HIV virus. I mean, again, highly renowned, and as soon as he started pursuing this, his career basically was destroyed. So unfortunately, this is why scientists have a very hard time getting into this area, exploring it openly, because they're destroyed for doing so. And it's really sad, but what's exciting is that there is a lot of research going on especially in places that aren't maybe so heavily constrained. And so there's a lot of work going on in Europe, in certain parts of Europe, and in Russia there's a lot of research going on. And when I show you a couple of books, their research appears in these books, and you're going to see just how much information there is about how different water is and how really it is this incredible carrier of information. Okay? Now we're going to take a look at Dr. Gerald Pollack real briefly, because Dr. Pollack, he is a professor of the University of Washington, has also had his position challenged, although he is not proposing information carried by water in the same way these other guys are. I think he's very open to it. He runs a water conference, an annual water conference with all these scientists that I'm referring to. He's very aware of the research that's going on. He's very aware of how dangerous it is to talk about water carrying information. But he has very clearly demonstrated the structuring of water within the body. And it's really fascinating. Fascinating to the point that I don't understand why every scientist isn't simply acknowledging it, because as you go through just this presentation, you're going to see that he shows it. He demonstrates it visually. And you can see it in videos. This is what's incredible to me. So he's found that water has this hexagonal structure when it comes in contact with water-loving surfaces, which is going to involve, your cell surfaces and most of the surfaces within the body. And therefore you have this structuring of water that goes on throughout the body. And when you structure water, it takes on more of a gel-like quality. And when you have a gel, you can imagine, compared to water, if you let's say you had a cup of water and you put your finger in it, it's not going to hold that information very long. It's going to ripple out, and then that's going to disappear. But if you had a piece of, a bowl of Jell-O over here and you stuck your finger in it, it would hold that information. That fingerprint would be held there. And that's how I want you to think about the difference between just water, bulk water, and structured water, which is what happens inside the body. We know when we're talking about many of the fluids inside the body, we know that they are sticky and gel-like. The blood itself is not fluid, it's very sticky, a sticky substance. And so we know that this can hold information in a way that just liquid bulk water could not. And we understand why scientists find it hard to believe that water could retain information, because they're thinking about the liquid water that would quickly lose it. So if you take a look at Dr. Pollack's work, he literally shows what he calls an exclusion zone. So he calls this EZ water. What happens is when you have a water-loving surface and the water comes up against it, it starts to separate. And what it does is it actually pushes out any of the substances within the water all get pushed out, and this area becomes not only purified, this is the exclusion zone in here where everything else has gotten pushed out, but it takes on a charge and an opposite charge to the stuff that gets pushed out. So literally you have a negative and positive charge all throughout the body because of water. In other words, water creates a battery within the body, all throughout the body. What's really cool is this exclusion zone builds up under light, and in particular infrared light or heat. And so when we're exposed to light and heat, we get out in the sunshine. Why do we feel charged? Because we are literally getting charged by the sun. It is free for us to go get charged from the water that's in our body with the sunshine. So it's really, really fascinating. And Pollack's lab is researching this in terms of power, in terms of water filtration, all sorts of things that can make a really big difference in the world based on this idea that water does structure itself. And again, he shows that. If you take a look here, you're going to see a quick video that just shows water droplets being dropped onto water and yet retaining themselves as droplets, balls of water floating on water. You would think that they would just go right into the water. The water goes into water because there's no structure. But that's not the case. You're going to see water balls literally floating on top of water until they eventually break and dissipate. But that's the structure you're seeing in water. When you get to this concept of water structuring like this, it actually explains a lot of the anomalies about water that actually science doesn't know how to explain very well. It's really fascinating. Again, I'll refer you to his book in a few minutes. I highly encourage you to read this because it's a tremendous read and really explains it clearly with pictures and just simple to follow text, in my opinion. And it helps to explain some of these anomalies. For instance, one thing that I like to point out is if you think about water rising up out of the lakes and oceans and going into the air, you have to ask yourself a question. If it's all going up from across the entire surface, why don't we just have mist everywhere? Why do we have clouds instead of just mist everywhere? Well, clearly, those are all being attracted to each other. And the question is why? So when you take a look at this next slide, what you will see is that the droplets of water that are going up, they have this negative charge, like we just talked about, and out further away, they have this positive charge, like we talked about. They separate charge, okay? And then when you have another one here that has a negative charge, but then a positive charge out here, what that does is it produces a very strong positive charge in between the two droplets. And as a result, the negative charge around the droplets themselves are strongly attracted to that now much stronger positive charge in the middle. And so they all come together. And this is all because they're getting structured and creating this exclusion zone, like Dr. Pollack explains. So here's another slide that just briefly shows you this idea of the negative and the positive charge and how it represents a battery. And in this next video, you're going to see them actually demonstrating how when you charge water in two different vials, you can actually create a bridge between those vials and separate them by several centimeters and create a water bridge because the water is charged, which is incredible because we think of water as just this flowing thing that could never take enough structure to create a bridge, and yet it does. Check out this video on that. This whole concept of structured water and the characteristics it takes on is also really interesting in terms of what else goes on in the body, because one of the things that they have shown, and we'll show you a quick clip on this as well, they take these little tubes, with water-loving surfaces, these little tubes, and they put these nanospheres inside, okay? And what happened? And then they charged it with light so that these easy layers would be created. And what they found is it actually created a flow, a non-stop flow through that tube of water. So they put this in water, and the water would just flow through it. And you can see that movement because of the nanoparticles they put inside. You can see them moving through the tube. And so this actually suggests to us how blood, which is this thick substance, and we'll talk more about the heart as a pump in one of our later videos, but how this idea that just because blood is based on structured water, that it should be able to flow through all the tubes, i.e. all the blood vessels in the body on its own. And so this creates a really fascinating possibility about how circulation really works and how the heart works with it. So there's something to consider, and we'll talk more about the heart as a pump, but check out this very quick clip so you can see that visually for yourself.
You get constant flow through the tube. And the experiment is shown here. You take the tube and you quickly you fill it with water to make sure there are no air bubbles. Put it in a water bath that also contains microspheres, so you can see if there's any movement. Put it in the microscope, and the result is shown here. So you see, so you have the flow, and the flow keeps going.
Just to conclude on Dr. Pollack, I said that he doesn't really go into the concept of water carrying information, but that he is acutely aware of this and is interacting with other scientists who have researched this. So he has proposed at least one concept of how this is possible. So I want you to think about computers for a second. We all know that computer code runs on ones and zeros. Even if we don't know how, this idea of this binary ones and zeros concept of programming everything you see on your computer, it's all ones and zeros. Two states, either on or off. Two states, okay? That's what binary is, and it allows somebody to code anything you see on your computer. So now the question is, well, what if something had more than just two states? What if it wasn't just on and off? Because when you have two digits that can be on and off, and then the other one can be on and off, you have four possible states, 2 times 2. And when you have 3 digits combined, you move up to 8 possibilities. But oxygen, for example, within water, oxygen has 5 different oxidative states. And as a result, you can have, instead of just an on and an off, you can have 5 different sort of positions for each digit effectively within the water. And so if you combine 3 of these, you would have 5 times 5 times 5, or 125 possibilities with 3 digits, instead of just 8 with the binary system. So you can imagine with the coding that is done in a computer, just, I don't know, billions of ones and zeros to program something, you take that same number of digits with water, and it would be able to contain just immensely more information. At just about 6 digits, I believe, your binary system would give you 64 possibilities. The same 6 digits with 5 different states, you would be at over 15,000 possibilities compared to 64. So now imagine that at billions of digits. So water would be a much, if this is true, and this is just a theory that Dr. Pollack has, but it gives us a concept of how water could be this extremely detailed and efficient carrier of information. And we know that life loves efficiency, so it makes a lot of sense that this type of concept may be how water does carry information. Now we'll take a quick look at something called chirality with water. So chirality is something that happens in life already. So you take hands, which if placed over top of each other, I'll put this away, placed over top of each other, would not overlap, right? Same with feet. So the body is chiral in nature because it does not overlap like that. Whereas if you took two objects like a baseball and another baseball, and you put them over top of each other, they would be non-chiral because they do match up. And so what we find is that the proteins that make up life, a lot of the things that make up life, have this chiral nature to them. And scientists have thought that perhaps this was just a random selection by nature, but in fact, some of the water scientists that are out there have looked at things like the iterative processes of water in nature, whether that's, an instance of that might be water from waves on the shore, going into the shore and then coming back through the sand, and up on the shore and coming back through the sand. And they looked at examples like that, and they ended up studying the water on a microscopic level, and they found that these, like, basically these clouds, and we show a picture of that here, of these chiral, they were able to capture these chiral pictures within the water. And so their suggestion is that water itself is carrying the information of life, and that chiral nature came from just the natural iterative processes that from things like that water rushing up on the beach. So this is another bit of information that came about suggesting how the chiral was not an accident. It came from this process, and water carried that information into life itself, right? So it's just another interesting thing to take a look at. Another couple of things we'll look at is how water shapes reality now. As you can see from this slide, basically we have this research that was done, and we have this quote that says, we've shown that the final shape of a protein depends on two things: water and the amino acids themselves, the amino acids that make the protein. We can now say that on ultra-fast timescales, the protein surface fluctuations are controlled by water fluctuations. Water molecules work together like a big network to drive the movement of proteins. So that's fascinating in itself. And here we're going to take a look at what I mentioned before, which was DNA. So in this slide, if you look at where the red arrow is pointing, you're going to see where it's basically telling you that water is what actually influences the shape of the DNA itself. So it's carrying information and can restructure the DNA, right? And yet if the DNA gets physically damaged and the water then has to shape around it physically damaged, it's now going to carry different information and can affect the water of the other DNA in the body. And this is not in this research. What I'm telling you this separately. The water can actually then share information with other water in the body and encourage more of that damage, or we can reintroduce correct information into the water, and then hopefully that water is moving things back in the correct direction. That is the goal, of course, was we provide information via water with infoceuticals. We're always looking to restore the correct information in the water, because water has such a huge impact on the structures that take place in the body, the things right down to the DNA. So, as promised, just wanted to share with you a couple of the books that I've been referencing here. One is The Emerging Science of Water. This is where you're going to get information from a lot of the scientists that are doing research around the world. The other is The Fourth Phase of Water by Dr. Pollack. Highly recommend both. Dr. Pollack's is especially well written and easy to understand. The Emerging Science of Water, well, maybe not quite as easy to understand, goes through a lot of different people's research, and it's a good way to get sort of an overview of things that are being explored out there. Now, what I want to end up discussing here is now shape. We're going to kind of conclude on this, because this carries us back to this original topic we said of standing waves and the precision of that plate. You remember this. So now we're talking about, again, waves carrying information, but that information being altered if you move that plate. Remember that standing wave collapsed, and those levitating balls all started to move at first when you got a little bit out of position, and when it came down far enough, they completely collapsed and fell out, right? That standing wave collapsed. There was a little room for error to retain the levitation, but as soon as it moved to a certain point, it collapsed. And so this goes back to something that Peter Fraser had studied when he was doing his matching experiments, which sort of were the foundation of what became Ness Health. And so one of the things he discovered was that there was communication between two test items, and we'll talk about that in another video, how he went about his testing. But he would find that if something was moved out of position with the other thing, something that previously had matched would no longer match. And he found that things, when they moved out of about a 5% alignment, then all of a sudden the match that he had found would drop out. And he says that he believed from his experiments that this had a lot to do with the sort of the square shape of a lot of epithelial cells, that they could line themselves up within this perfect alignment, or within that 5% range, and they were able to carry information that way. And so he showed that when they would go out of a certain position with one another, that information would drop. Well, that goes really well with something that Dr. Pollack found with water itself. He suggested that the shape of a water-loving surface would actually help to determine how large an easy layer could build up. So if you think about a cell, right, he said if it was a nice smooth surface, you would have you could build a large layer. But if there became distortions in the surface, then the structuring that was taking place would have a harder time to take place, and the layer could not build up as much. So once again, we have a real importance to shape in the body. Okay? We also know that shapes tune and amplify things like sound. They amplify energy is what really happens. And so all the shapes in the body, the cavities, the cells, the little microtubules within the cells, all these shapes within the body have to be as precise as possible, just like that reflecting plate that was used in that levitation. They need to be as accurate as possible. And when we start to have little deviations, you start to have little information misfires, and it starts to cause problems little by little. We know most people, unless something really acute takes place, but a lot of people get sicker and sicker over time, over the years, just little things breaking down over and over. And it's because this is happening, and we need to retain accurate information at every level of the body field so that these subtle things don't become grander things over time. So I really believe that shape is an essential part of what's going on within the body field, and is an essential part to source energy, as I referred to before, because again, sounds are that could be the sounds of the breathing, of the heartbeat, of the nervous system and the brain waves. All these different sounds are amplified and represent a way for all the cavities of the body to amplify that. So between that and this structuring of water, which creates a battery itself, we have a real foundation for where source energy comes from, and we will talk about source energy more in our energetic drivers. One more thing that I want to share with you, one more book I want to share with you is Science in the Akashic Field. This is where that quote came from at the very beginning of this presentation, and I want to give you one more quote from that book. It says, "An organism is in thermodynamic equilibrium only when it is dead. As long as it is living, it is in a state of dynamic equilibrium in which it stores energy and information and has them available to drive and direct its vital functions." I really wanted to pull this out because it's hard to say it better than that. You need energy and information to drive all the things that are happening in the body. And there's a lot of books that talk about this thing. I highly recommend this particular book. It's almost like you won't stop highlighting if you want to geek out on some of this type of information. It's a great one to geek out on. It's well written, a lot of really good examples, and it just gives those types of quotes that you can really hang your hat on when you're talking to clients if you want to. And just one other thing that leads us into, then we're going to talk next about all of our different screens and all of that. But to kind of conclude on this, on the science of all this, is just really fascinating. An article I came across recently, and it's why I'm encouraging you to keep an eye out for articles that are coming out now, because so many fascinating things are being found. And so what this article tells us is basically, the title is "Neuroscientists Say They've Found an Entirely New Form of Neural Communication." Basically, if you just do a search online for this article, you're going to be able to find the entire thing and can read through it. But effectively, what they're saying is they understand the brain to have a particular type of more or less continuous communication system. Yeah, you have all these neurons and you have information hopping across the little spaces between them. But what they found was that they could actually split things and find an entirely wireless system of communication. In other words, they don't know how to explain it, but somehow information is passing through space. Imagine that. It's what we've been talking about since the foundation of Nest Health. It's what many bioenergetic practitioners have been exploring over the years. And it's what science is increasingly finding to be true. As we explore water, as we explore how things like that in the brain, we're just every day more confirming the things that we've been doing over many years here, and confirming why perhaps we're getting the kind of exciting results that we get with infoceuticals. We're really seeing things that Western medicine can't explain, doesn't know how to explain, and could not achieve itself in its usual ways outside of referring to miracles, right? We see those types of things when we work with the body in different ways besides just suppressing symptoms. And that's what we're going to get into is as we talk about infoceuticals, we'll talk about what they're really about, supporting the body field, supporting the correct information in the body so that the body can go through its own miraculous processes of healing itself. It has the ability to do this. It just needs the right information, and that's what we're all about here. So I hope this was a good introduction and overview of the science that we're working with. And next, we're going to get right into the software, and we're going to talk some of the history of matches and things like that. So let's get right into that.